in philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. And he joins us today to chat about his new book, Ministers of Propaganda, Truth, Power, and the Ideology of the Religious Right. Scott, welcome to the Gravity Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's delightful to be here.
Tell us a bit, Scott, about how you grew up. I'm always curious, people who go into teaching philosophy, how that happened to them. So tell us a bit about how you grew up, and then when you decided that you wanted to devote your academic life to philosophy.
Sure. So I grew up in sort of conservative, predominantly white evangelical spaces. I wouldn't say that my upbringing was particularly fundamentalist, but the sort of, I guess, social circles I found myself traveling in as a youth were not what you might call progressive. I grew up sort of in the shadow of one of the 6 major SBC seminaries. And that was, I think, fortunate with respect to the tools that it gave me for thinking through my faith. My 4-year-old has something to... What's up, buddy?
Maybe he's got a take on why you're a philosopher. Let's see what the let's see what the kid has to say.
Hey, listen. I mean, kids in philosophy, that's a book right there. I appreciate that.
It's probably in the why stage. Why are you a philosopher, Dad? What does that mean?
Tell me more. Or no. Maybe it's a no too. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, I don't want you to be that.
We were very clear beforehand that there weren't any interruptions. Well, I mean, not as clear as I thought. Apparently. Okay,
are you saying your 4-year-old sometimes doesn't listen? I'm not sure if we can interview you. I don't know.
Oh man.
No, that's totally fine, man.
My parents tell me that I had it coming. So,
because you were a precocious, question-asking young chap.
He's brilliant.
Aww.
He says stuff every... I mean, obviously I'm biased, but he says stuff every day where I'm like, I have to remember to tell my wife. What do you?
Yeah.
Because it's like, where does he even get this stuff?
Yeah, we started keeping a little book because my son would say things that were like questions that I just never thought of before, and my daughter would, say things that were hysterical, and we started having to write everything down because it was just too much to remember.
Oh, he asked me yesterday, or 2 days ago, he asked me if God got tired from making the days every day. And then he asked me why God made dangerous animals.
Yeah. Or mosquitoes. Yeah. Because
and they actually qualify as a dangerous animal.
They seem superfluous. Malaria.
Yeah.
All right, so chip off the old block, maybe, is what you're saying.
Could be.
A bit. A bit. Yeah, so I think I was fortunate to grow up in an environment where, theologically speaking, reason, sort of logic, systematization were sort of emphasized, right? Because, I mean, you hear about certain enclaves of evangelicalism where, things don't necessarily need to fit together in any particular kind of way, and like you're not supposed to ask any questions about it.
Yeah, kind of an anti-intellectualism or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't, that's a prominent strand that runs through, a lot of evangelicalism. So I don't want to suggest that that was totally absent, but um, I had a basic framework and sort of toolkit and permission, which I owe a lot to my parents for encouraging me to ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's in terms of my background, that's I guess that's the relevant bit.
Yeah.
I think actually I would point to a couple of things that led me to want to study philosophy. One would be the emphasis in the Christian tradition generally on metaphysics, right? So you learn very early on that there's perception and then there's reality, and they aren't necessarily the same thing. And there's a lot of reflection on that sort of gap, which is inherently philosophical, right? And then, so as I say, this sort of anti-intellectual bit wasn't, completely absent. I remember on a couple of occasions hearing preachers say something along the lines of, well, according to these intellectuals, there's no absolute truth. Well, that's an absolute truth claim. Isn't that ridiculous? And I remember thinking to myself, I mean, at a fairly young age, like, he's making it sound like these people are really, really stupid. Surely they can't be that stupid, and of course they're not. They're not, right? Come to find out, but yeah, and I decided to study philosophy. I actually went to undergraduate with the entered my sort of undergraduate training with the intention of going to law school, and I heard that philosophy is a good pre-law major. So I had these questions that I would sort of reflect on, but I didn't really have the sense that they were sort of academic questions,
Yeah.
And I went to college planning to go to law school, and I heard philosophy is a good pre-law major, so I signed up. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a philosophy major, because I thought I don't really want to work for somebody else, but I'll get a law degree, make some money, and I'll get paid to argue, which I kind of enjoy, and then I'll just sort of at some point quit and do what I want, So anyway, I'm in my first philosophy class because I decided to major in philosophy, go to law school. Literally the first meeting of my first philosophy class, I thought, wait a second, like, people do this for a living? That's wild, right? Because I mean, they're bringing up all these questions that I didn't realize were, serious academic interests, and so I called my parents after literally my first philosophy class, and I said, I'm getting a PhD in philosophy. This is what I'm doing.
Wow.
So,
well, that's great. I think it comes through in your writing, Scott. Sometimes philosophy has maybe the unfortunate reputation of being abstruse or hard to access. But this book was actually refreshing because I think philosophy can help name things, dynamics within things that help us get our bearings. And so I'd love to, at the beginning of this interview, allow you to name some of the important concepts and important phrases that you use. And one of them is right in the title, this word propaganda. It has sort of a general, ambiguous, agreed upon understanding in the common parlance of our world, but you're using it in a particular way to describe arguments or ideas that do particular work. Can you tell us how you're using the word propaganda, and then maybe begin to tell us how it functions in white evangelicalism?
Sure. If you don't mind, before I address that directly, if I could just take about a step and a half or 2 steps back.
Sure.
Just to sort of situate it. Because as you say, there are all sorts of, different kinds of propaganda. There's, some types of art constitute propaganda, film, speeches might involve propaganda. Um, so I just want to say a little bit about the very
outside in the backyard.
buddy. No, not right now. It's too. You're not dressed, and I can't get you dressed, buddy. I just need a few more minutes, okay?
I'll just dress in the
If it makes them feel any better, my kids are downstairs like stomping around, and I'm like trying to text them like, "Hey y'all, spring break I know started, but spring break is like,
Stomping around.
you know,
I will be
the
right.
March Madness,
Sure.
and I'm like, here's what you need to make for lunch while I'm on this podcast."
You guys, I can't actually exit out of my screen here. My screen's frozen.
Do we want to?
Ben? No, we got to keep going.
Which screen are you frozen on, Matt?
Just this. Okay, maybe that did it. I'm wondering if it's Let's see.
I am so sorry. My spouse very much needed a day off from here, so
All good.
You're
man.
good.
I've been in.
I got 6 kids. I get it.
Whew.
So no
Yeah,
worries.
man. We can edit it and stuff.
Yep, we'll just
Yeah.
take that little part out.
What if I back up instead of asking you the question about propaganda? I can ask you another question that lets you set it up. How about that?
Great.
And then we
So
can just
the way the process usually, I think the most straightforward way to introduce it is first by saying a little bit about ideology, and then situating propaganda relative to ideology, sort
Okay.
of couching it in ideology. But I can do it however you like. So
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Ben, will you just mark kind of where we're at here?
Yeah, I'm trying to put some markers in here. So
Okay.
we
Great.
can edit it.
thank you so much for your patience.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
problem.
No worries. Scott, let's turn to the book that you've written, because it really is not a book of straight philosophy, but it's sort of a cultural exegesis or a philosophical exegesis of what's happening in the movement of white evangelicalism over the last 100 years or so. And I think it really helps us to get our bearings within a lot of dynamics and intuitions that we have, but we're not able to put words to it. So maybe talk us to a bit about how did this book come to be? What was the genesis or catalyst for you writing this book? And then what's a good entry point into how the reader can understand what you're trying to accomplish?
Great. I love that question. So the sort of animating question that led to this project was this: why is it that so many conservative white evangelicals appear to inhabit an alternative reality?
Yeah.
I have to think that at least some of them, if I want to be charitable about it, and I do, then probably a lot of them are operating sincerely in good faith, and trying to believe the truth and do the right thing. How is it that they're missing the mark so badly, intellectually and morally? And might it turn out to be the case that these two things are related? And I think if I had written this book 10 years ago, for reasons to do with my own intellectual development and exposure to other sort of literature in this genre, which is sort of exploding over the last 10 years, it turned out differently. But if I had written this book maybe 10 years ago, it would have focused on the relationship between beliefs about morality, right? And because that's sort of my dissertation dealt with, moral epistemology, moral knowledge. And I would have, I think probably said something like this: look, the reason why evangelicals get things so badly wrong when it comes to this culture warring type stuff, seeking their own advantage, always appearing to be on the side of those who enjoy the privileges of power and wealth and so forth. The reason for this is that evangelicals aren't thinking clearly, about the nature of justice, God's orientation toward institutional justice. This is not the concerns about systemic injustice.
Yeah.
Of which, for example, systemic racism is one instance.
Yeah.
Concerns about systemic justice are not new. The Hebrew Bible is, this is that it's no secret that God in the Hebrew Bible is often upset. Right?
Yeah.
To put it sort of anthropomorphically.
Yeah.
Often, what God is upset about is what we would call systemic or institutional injustice. Right? In any case, if I'd written the book 10 years ago, I would have said, look, evangelicals aren't thinking clearly about morality and justice, and that's why they're, adopting these sorts of positions. But what I have come to realize, in the course of my research, is that this isn't sort of a one-way street, right? It's not just that, people behave badly because they think poorly,
Right.
That's part of it. If you think poorly, you will behave badly, right? But it turns out that actually behaving badly leads to thinking poorly, right? There's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
And this is how I define ideology, right? We could say in general terms that ideology is a belief system that's oriented around certain social or political or economic objectives, right? Rather than, straightforwardly tracking the truth. So we could define ideology, I do define ideology, as a feedback loop between cognition or belief or intellect on the one hand, and then on the other hand, social practices, social hierarchies, social structures that one prefers, right? So a lot of what the book is about is sort of the conduits in this feedback loop. Things like legitimizing narratives, propaganda. So legitimizing narrative, let's unpack that a bit, right? As I've said, ideology kind of revolves around social hierarchy. It could be racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy, economic hierarchy, whatever you like. Okay. Often it involves, these days, elements of all of those things, right? So there's at the core of ideology, there's a social hierarchy that needs to be preserved in the mind of one who embraces the ideology. Now, without sort of a story about why things should be the way they are, stratification, social stratification or social hierarchy is just that. It's just hierarchy, right? So, why is it that some people have power, wealth, privilege, opportunity, and so on, while other people are disenfranchised and oppressed and impoverished? Why? There's got to be some kind of story about why that's okay. Otherwise, people aren't going to put up with it, right? So we tend to construct stories about why the social hierarchy that we prefer is morally legitimate. And this is called a legitimizing narrative. It's a story that we tell ourselves about why the social arrangements that we prefer are good.
Yeah. Scott, can you give us an example of a legitimizing narrative that comes from ideology to make sense of reality in that way?
Absolutely, and I'll even be a bit more specific than that. So one of the major themes of the book is the way in which white evangelicals tend to draw legitimizing narratives from the resources of Christian theology. So they tend to look at Scripture, and because I mean, you can't argue with God, right? So if you can pull a legitimizing narrative out of the Bible, that's really something,
That settles it, man.
That's right. So one of the major themes of the book is the way that white evangelicals tend to pull legitimizing narratives out of Scripture specifically. And I'll give you an example. So in the middle of the 19th century, sometimes I think folks look back at this is actually not age appropriate. I was going to try to just do it, but I can't. I'm going to use some strong language here, buddy. You got it, buddy. Come on, you got it. You want to go outside? Go outside. You can go outside. All right, let's go outside.
Just while
I will be unable to mute, by the way, because my whole screen's frozen.
okay. I was gonna ask the basketball referee analogy.
Christy, is there enough information there to make sense of it?
Okay. He's outside. He'll dig in the dirt for 4 hours straight. So he shouldn't be interrupted again.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
So I'm happy I can pick right back up where I was.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So I'll give you an example of a legitimizing narrative that is taken from Scripture that legitimized a particular kind of social arrangement that benefited white evangelicals, right?
Yeah.
So we think back to the middle of the 19th century. Sometimes you see in sort of popular discourse about, some cherished theologian or politician or some such that had a history of enslaving other human beings, that, he's a man of his times or something like this.
Yes.
Utter nonsense, right? It is not as though in the middle of the 19th century, it just hadn't occurred to anyone that race-based chattel slavery was iniquitous. All of our North Atlantic peers had outlawed the institution.
Even slave owners themselves wrote about how awful and heinous the institution was, a la Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. but
knew it was iniquitous.
Yeah, but it was also, unfortunately, devastatingly profitable.
Indeed. And that gets into motivated reasoning.
Yeah, okay, so this is good. Like, as much as we can, because this stuff still happens. We still do legitimizing narratives, and we have motivated reasoning, and then we recruit and use Scripture as Christians. And all of this, Scott, this is why it's so important. None of this needs nefarious intent or motive. None of it.
Exactly.
So keep unpacking this, because I think it's really helpful.
Okay, so if you're a white evangelical in the antebellum South, and you've got people all around you telling you that race-based chattel slavery is iniquitous and it needs to be outlawed and abandoned, as the listener will know, the United States itself was bitterly divided over the issue. There were denominational splits: Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. How do you justify this practice? Well, as I identify, this sort of recurring pattern in the history of American white evangelicalism, when white evangelicals need to defend the indefensible, they turn to what I call the hermeneutics of legitimization, which is to say this practice of interpreting Scripture in ways that legitimize social arrangements that benefit themselves, often to the detriment of marginalized groups. So here's a really paradigm example. White evangelicals in the antebellum South looking to defend race-based chattel slavery, they look to Genesis 9. There are a number of proof texts they used, right? But Genesis 9. What's happening in Genesis 9? the floodwaters have receded. Noah exits the ark. He plants a vineyard. He then ferments wine, as one does. And he gets drunk. He gets obliterated, right? And he ends up passed out, drunk, and naked in his tent. And the youngest of Noah's sons, Ham, wanders into Noah's tent and encounters his dad, drunk, naked, and unconscious. And he goes and he tells his two other brothers, hey, dad is, drunk, naked, and unconscious in his tent. And they're mortified, right? So they, Shem and Japheth, Ham's two older brothers, walk backward into Noah's tent to avoid seeing their father naked. And as they walk, they're carrying a cloak. They drape the cloak over their father, to cover his nakedness. And the narrative, the biblical narrative, is a bit, ambiguous as far as, exactly who did what, when, why, and so forth. But the reader's left to infer that Ham didn't do the right thing. And Noah wakes up and he is angry. I think we can infer from the context that he's suffering from a formidable headache. But he's upset. And we learn, a few verses later, toward the end of chapter 9, that he's 600 years old at the time. So we've got this, 600-year-old hungover Noah, who, in his anger, curses not Ham, not all of Ham's sons. He had 4 sons, but just one of Ham's 4 sons, namely Canaan. And the curse is this, that Canaan and Canaan's descendants are to be slaves to the descendants of Shem and Japheth in perpetuity, right? So if you're a sort of Confederate theologian in the antebellum South, what do you do with this narrative? Well, you say, obviously, this curse of Canaan is still in effect. Obviously is in scare quotes here. It's not obvious at all, right? But, well, obviously the curse of Canaan is still in effect. And obviously the descendants of Canaan made their way to the continent of Africa and now find themselves in the American South.
Yes.
So there you have it. Never mind that at no point does God endorse this curse. I mean, it seems like Noah was hungover and mad, and he cursed one of his grandkids. God doesn't say like, yeah, that's right. It's Noah's thing. But there's this whole sort of systematic theology that's built around one phrase that gets used is that like the intergenerational moral turpitude of Ham and his descendants.
Yeah.
Right. Now, all this is meant to justify race-based chattel slavery. Fast forward 100 years, slavery's, been outlawed for some time, but we still have this notion of white supremacy and the practice of racial segregation. Yeah. This narrative shows up again, but in this context, there's sort of some wrinkles added to it, right? So let's back up to Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. God places on Cain a mark, the mark of Cain. According to this narrative, the mark of Cain is darkened skin. So Cain is a black man at this point. Now, the text doesn't indicate that this is heritable, but according to this narrative, Cain passes this mark of blackness on to his children. And the way that the descendants of Cain survive the flood is that one of Cain's descendants marries one of Noah's sons.
Oh.
Namely Ham. Right? And according to this narrative, part of what goes into the curse of Ham, and indeed the intergenerational sort of moral and intellectual inferiority of Ham and his descendants, is this quote unquote interracial marriage between Ham and this descendant of Cain. So, I mean, obviously, again, scare quotes, not obvious at all. Obviously, this is, the Bible pronouncing interracial marriage to be wrong. And, so we can't have integration, because if we integrate schools, then before you know it, we'll have interracial marriage. And clearly that's wrong, because, Genesis, right?
Yeah.
Last point here. There are white evangelical, very prominent white evangelical, as I document in the book, uh, ministers, sort of celebrity preachers, who still promote this narrative.
Yeah.
Right. And it's Samuel Perry and Philip Gorski call this sort of a deep narrative that sort of embedded itself in the white evangelical imagination. But in case it needs any reinforcement, you've got John MacArthur, who preaches a version of this. He doesn't say it all explicitly quite in the way that I just did, because that would be, I think, even for his audience, beyond the pale. But as I piece together in the book, I mean, you can see that he's promoting all of this, and it's not an accident that John MacArthur has been at the forefront of the latest wave of white evangelical resistance to calls for racial justice, because it's easy to dismiss systemic racism as a myth when you've got this sort of background legitimizing narrative that explains things like the racial wealth gap.
Yeah. Yeah. Not that what you're saying, I think oftentimes people will think about what you're saying, Scott, and they'll be like, well, yeah, but that was 150 years ago. And obviously, the mark of Cain, the mark on Cain and the curse of Ham, obviously, the scriptures doesn't say that was black skin, and none of that's, binding till today. But, I have a friend whose in-laws just paid for his entire family, his whole brood of 6 children, and to go to the Creation Museum down in Cincinnati.
Good.
And he took
this is another detail.
He took a picture of
this was the Ark Encounter.
The Ark Encounter, yeah.
Yep.
He took a picture of a depiction of Noah's family, and sure enough, all Noah's kids were white except for one.
Well, so I document this in the book, and by the way, you can find this on the website. You don't have to pay to go to the museum. All of it's on their website. So there are wax figures of Noah and his family, 8 people in all. Noah, Noah's wife, their 3 sons, and their sons' wives. One of those 8 figures has an unmistakably darker complexion than the other 7. She's a black woman, unmistakably. And I'll give you one guess as to who she was married to.
Yeah.
This is Ham's wife, right? Now, is that an oversight? Is that just a coincidence?
Well, there's an interpretive history they're operating in, right? I mean, there's a wealth of biblical expositors who've made this argument, and so, much like you talk in the book about a literal 7-day creation. When I became a Christian, that was just sort of the standard. If you're serious about the Bible, you believe in a literal 7-day creation, 24 hours, and it just was unquestioned. And so, I actually believe that these aren't. There's some people that I think are operating in bad faith, but the reason why your book's important is because once we understand how ideology works, how legitimizing narratives work, how propaganda works, now you don't actually need conscious willfulness intent. You don't need some kind of really, really evil villain, like from the 1970s, back when villains were villains, and they wore dark suits and talked in a low voice. Like, you don't need to be that kind of person to propagate and believe really bad stuff.
Well, this was my life, y'all. Like, I went to like a little Christian Baptist school, and what you just told, Scott, was the history that I learned, and that was not 150 years ago. I'm not that old. And so, but what's fascinating is now having conversations with specifically my parents, and how even untangling thoughts, beliefs, ideas, doctrine that they believed and kind of passed down, as they have now untangled that in their 60s and 70s, it has caused serious deconstruction in their faith. And I don't mean serious in a bad way. I mean, like, actually in a good way. Like, it's been difficult for them, but it has been really helpful. And I'm wondering if maybe you can unpack how deconstruction kind of is connected to propaganda, ideology, and kind of maybe play that out. I mean, obviously you just heard my example, but there's more.
Yeah, so an important ideology doesn't function in a vacuum. It emerges within an ecosystem
Hmm.
uh, of that involves a variety of factors. And by the way, everyone is susceptible to the elements of ideology. But um, if you I can say a little bit more perhaps later about what I think distinguishes a certain kind of white evangelical ideology from because I'm not immune to it. Why think that I'm any that I have anything important or relevant to say about it, given that I'm susceptible to the same sorts of things. I can say more about that later on, but one really important element in ideology is what's called motivated reasoning. That's reasoning that's motivated by self-interest. Motivated reasoning is the reason why we expect judges to recuse themselves from
Yes.
cases where the outcome might affect their material interests. And by the way, it's not because we assume that the judge lacks integrity. That's not the point. The point is that your interests, your desires actually affect how you perceive reality.
Something about human psychology. Something about
Yes.
how we're
Yes. Go
yeah.
to a sports bar the night of the Super Bowl in a neutral city. And let's say half the bar it's a neutral city, right? So half the bar is rooting for one team, half the bar is rooting for the other team. And, let's suppose it's a close game and the game is coming down to the wire and there's a close play. Was it a catch? Was it a reception or an incomplete pass? Did the guy step out of bounds on the 20-yard line or did he make it all the way to the end zone? And what you'll see in the cases of those close calls is that half the bar that's rooting for one team will be absolutely convinced that things happened one way. And the other half of the bar will be absolutely convinced that things happen the opposite way. And it's not performative, right? I mean, there may be an aspect to it there, but they understand that their cheering or their booing or whatever is going to have absolutely no impact on anything. They're in a city that's far away from where the game is taking place. It's not going to influence anything. They genuinely believe that things happened in such a way that favors the outcome they prefer. Right? That's motivated reasoning. So you ask yourself, I mean, how could people, sometimes I have occasion in discussing ideology to pull out this example involving Genesis 9 and this sort of theological legitimization of race-based chattel slavery. And my students often just sort of sit there in disbelief because it's incredibly, it's numbskullery. I mean, you can't, I can't even talk about it in more elevated language than that. I mean, it's just really just impoverished reasoning. How could people have thought this? Were some of them insincere? Do I think that in some cases, historically and in the present day, that some people might be operating in bad faith? It's difficult to imagine that, there aren't at least some people who are operating in bad faith. And indeed, in some cases, the most charitable gloss on the situation is that someone's lying. Because the alternative is like they're just like extremely unintelligent.
Right.
But I don't take a position in the book, on whether anyone's operating in faith or whatever. I think historically and in the present day, sure, there may be some people operating in bad faith. There may be some sort of dishonest actors, but I think a lot of people are operating in good faith.
Yeah.
And so how does someone sincerely believe this, right? That to me is a far more interesting question than like who's lying, like what's going on intellectually when people believe this stuff. And importantly, none of this is to excuse it, right? Just because it's sincere.
Yeah.
And particularly in the case of Christians, because, and this is the point, right? This is what I think actually separates sort of the approach of, even though I'm still susceptible to ideology, motivated reasoning, all the rest, I think what separates my reflection on these things from, say, the folks I'm criticizing is that I believe that one of the most important things that Christ calls us to do is to set aside our own interests. Right? And so I think actually Christianity has a sort of this built-in antidote
Mhm.
to something like motivated reasoning, right? And so the difference between me and the people who disagree with me, among other things, is if they get their way, it benefits them materially. Whereas if I win, I don't know, I might have to pay more taxes, right?
Mhm.
Uh, but you know, and I will lose some of the privileges that come with being a white male with a certain level of education and so forth.
Yeah.
That's an important difference.
Yeah. Yeah, Scott, that's really helpful. Um, well, I know sometimes it's hard to have these conversations with people because, and you're naming some of the obstacles that get in the way, right? So you talk a little bit about um, this this idea. I forget actually what you call it in the book, but I think Emerson and Smith called it 20 years ago, like free will individualism. Like like there's this idea in white evangelicalism that if I haven't freely, volitionally, consciously chosen something, that I'm not responsible or culpable for it, right? Um, and I think this gets in the way sometimes when we're talking about things like systematic injustice. You know, there's a sense in which it's a really hard thing for people to see. But I thought you used a really good analogy in the book, and I wonder if you'd share it with us just to kind of give a flavor of how I don't know. I'm always looking for ways into helping people see things they can't see, and I thought your basketball game analogy, as it pertains to systematic racial injustice and inequality, was really good. Would you briefly share that with us, and then tell us how it relates to what's going on today in our world in terms of inequality?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think one obstacle to thinking clearly about these things is the sense that if one admits that there's some kind of racialized injustice that has yet to be rectified, that if one admits as a white person that there's racialized injustice that has yet to be rectified, and that perhaps one has some responsibility to rectify, that one is thereby admitting some kind of moral culpability. So I want to be very clear. There's a difference between saying someone has been deprived of something that they're due, and perhaps I should have some role in rectifying the injustice. There's a difference between that versus saying that I am responsible, for the injustice. Like I'm morally culpable for it.
Yeah,
My cable
this,
company sends, or well, nobody has a cable company anymore. But when my internet company sends me a bill, I don't say, "But I didn't do anything wrong," So to the point about the analogy, right? Um, and sort of systemic injustice. The thought experiment that I lay out in the book is, imagine that there's this. So it's to call into question this idea that really all we need is just racially neutral laws and public policies, and that will fix everything,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Or that we have had for some time racially neutral laws and public policies, and so all the
Right.
problems are solved, right? Okay, so imagine a future in which basketball games are refereed by what I call robo ref, which is this artificial intelligence computer system that has hundreds or thousands of cameras surveying every square inch of the basketball court, and making quick decisions about whether a player's out of bounds, which team should get the ball, foul, double dribble, so on and so forth, right? Robo ref. Now, robo ref is completely neutral. It has no sort of human sentiments. It can't be swayed by an unruly crowd or influenced by some kind of antagonism toward a particular player or team. It is a perfectly neutral referee. Now, imagine that in some regular season game between, let's say, uh, the green team and the blue team, right? It becomes apparent that RoboRef is malfunctioning in the following way. Every time the blue team collects a rebound, RoboRef calls a foul on the blue team, even if there are no green players in the vicinity, right? Okay, this seems to be a glitch in the system, right? But for the entirety of the first half, anytime the blue team rebounds the ball, they're assessed a foul. This has an impact on the game, right? The green team is free to rebound with impunity, right? Well, let's say by the end of the first half, the green team has amassed a formidable lead, let's say 40 points. And the blue team is, they have several players in foul trouble, okay? Well, at halftime, the glitch is fixed. And the officiating in the second half of the game is flawless, right? No one would say that this is a fair contest. Just because the second half of the game was officiated fairly. Why? Well, because the green team was able to amass a 40-point lead. That totally changes the complexion of the game, right? They're not even really playing the same sport at this point with a 40-point lead.
Yeah.
Even if it's technically possible for the blue team to overcome the deficit and win the game. Indeed, even if the blue team does overcome the deficit and win the game, it still wasn't a fair or a just contest, right? Why? Because that 40-point deficit was never rectified, but it had a massive impact on the game.
Yeah, so you change the referees, but you don't change the score. That's not
right.
You've maybe stopped accruing further injustice, but you haven't rectified the already done injustice.
Right. And notice we needn't ascribe any kind of culpability to the green team for the advantage that was unjustly conferred.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
They didn't program the robot. They didn't. Yeah. They weren't. Yeah.
I think what's helpful about this for me, Scott, is that I think we get caught up in our categories and language, and and like you're naming, there has to be something between personally guilty and no responsibility.
Yeah.
Sure.
There has to be something between those two things where we are living according to something other than just sort of isolated individual souls operating unto ourselves for our own self-interest.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's helpful for me about that analogy is that like the score, like we understand how this, like, the ref malfunctioning affects the score. And so there's this like disadvantage that has been accruing through the injustice, which is, I think that's part of what gets concealed in a lot of our talk about systemic injustice, is we treat it as if the only wrong that was done was sort of like hurt someone's feelings, or it was like a thing that was wrong that I did, that like, so I'm guilty personally, and so I need to apologize. But I think the fact that there's a score involved helps us understand the accrued effect of these long-term injustices that have been done for so long, to say, no, that like we have a 40-point lead because the ref malfunctioned. Like it's not like everything's now reset, and we're just going to have another game and it's going to be fine. There's like this injustice that has to be rectified. I think that's the other thing that I find helpful about that analogy, that I think could be helpful in terms of helping people understand how systemic injustice actually works. So,
yeah. Well, Scott, you do trace how motivated reasoning and propaganda works to sort of prop up these social hierarchies that benefit us. And then we find ways to justify or legitimize them. And you wrap up your book at the end talking about how to practically or personally confront what you call Christo-authoritarianism. And I wonder if you could just help us understand what you mean by this. I think our listeners are familiar with authoritarianism. We've talked about that. We've talked about Christian nationalism. So maybe if you need to, is it different than Christian nationalism? How would you delineate that? But then maybe by way of close, give us an imagination for one or two ways how we can follow Jesus not seeking the interest of ourselves, but outdoing one another and showing honor in the face of something as formidable as Christo authoritarianism.
Sure, sure. So, briefly, by way of comment on this term Christo authoritarianism, because I think the listener probably has as you say, a general sense of what authoritarianism is. As I go through the book and document different features of the ideology that I describe and ultimately call Christo authoritarianism, what I'm documenting is the uh, features of an ideology that political theorists traditionally call authoritarianism, right? Uh, a commitment to rigid social hierarchy as a source of moral order, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, this sense of a kind of national mythology, uh, racial resentments, this kind of thing. But to the point about nationalist mythology, that naturally raises the question of Christian nationalism. What's the relationship between Christo-authoritarianism and Christian nationalism? I'll say that to my mind, the domain of overlap is extensive, right? Could it be that what I'm describing is just kind of an iteration of this ideology that we call Christian nationalism? It's not my term, right? So Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead have written extensively on Christian nationalism. They were both kind enough to read the book and say nice things about it. I didn't really want to get in. It's written for a general audience, right? So I didn't want to get into sort of this extended discussion, sort of parsing what's the relationship between what I'm talking about and Christian nationalism and so on. And so on. They're connected, but I don't want to say they're identical because I don't necessarily want to quibble about that, right? So yeah, but this sort of mythology of America having been founded as a Christian nation, which is one important feature of at least a certain version of Christian nationalism, is important to Christo-authoritarianism because it confers the sense that one might be justified in adopting anti-democratic means, perhaps even involving violence, to reclaim what you might think of as, one's ideological inheritance or something like that, because if America was founded as a Christian nation, then America is meant to be for people like us. It's our country, and we're just taking back what's ours, even if we have to adopt some means that are unfortunate, to put it politely. Violence, suppressing votes among one's political rivals, so on and so forth. Okay. All right. So I think that's Christo-authoritarianism, the kind of relationship to Christian nationalism, and so on. So how do we resist it?
Yeah.
I have to say I'm not hugely optimistic about our prospects.
Okay.
As a nation.
Yeah.
But I do think that Christianity provides resources. I certainly don't think that like Franklin Graham or people who are fond of his body of work are going to pick up the book and read it and say like, oh, well, gee, I've been wrong all this time.
Yeah.
That's not, I don't have any illusions about that. But I do hope that some people who have perhaps begun the painful process of disentangling their faith from the politics of their parents' generation might find that the book brings some order to the chaos. And I think one way of resisting Christo-authoritarianism, at least on a personal, spiritual level that finds expression in politics is I think to maybe think of it this way: when you go to vote, there's one kind of motivation when you go into the voting booth that runs something like this: which politician or policy or platform is going to do things that are good for me? And I'm going to vote for that guy.
Mm-hmm. And
if that's your motivation and you're a Christian, then it might make sense to vote for a politician who says something as nonsensical as, I'm going to do stuff for Christians, or I've done more than any other politician for Christians, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Christian and you want somebody who's going to do stuff for Christians, then that makes sense to you. Okay, that's one motivation for voting. Okay, there's a very different motivation for voting that runs something like this: you go into the voting booth and you ask yourself, which politician or policy or platform is going to enact laws and public policies that bring our public institutions into greater conformity with the objective truth about what people deserve and what we owe to each other. In other words, justice. And you vote for justice, even if it means that maybe you got to pay higher taxes.
Yeah.
Which in the vast majority of cases it doesn't. We're talking about really people. Yeah. And by the way, I think that's not just that doesn't just provide Christians with sort of a toolkit for resisting this kind of self-serving and I think ultimately anti-Christian approach to scripture and theology and so forth. Although it does that, I think ultimately whatever hope there is for our political community, it has to look something like focusing on justice rather than just sort of our own competing interests.
Yes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just a bunch of different sort of special interest groups vying for political power, just
Vying
because we
for
want it.
control.
Yeah.
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 And we share a patch of geography, but we don't share a horizon in that case.
Yeah.
Right.
Just
Yeah. Scott, I'm
together,
thinking
fighting
I'm
with each
thinking about the harm I've experienced in my life from authoritarian people who embodied some of the ideologies and motivated reasonings that you talk about in your book. And the work I've done to learn about that hasn't changed many of them. But what it's done is it's changed their ability to impact me negatively. Meaning I'm able to see what's going on, and so then I'm less confused by it. I'm less blindsided by it. I'm less. I can see things beforehand, so that I'm not as that I wisely don't trust people who are untrustworthy, etc. And I just want to commend what you've done here, because I think you give us eyes to see and language to speak about what's happening culturally, the way that I've learned to deal with things like individually or personally. And that I think then can help us stop feeling dizzy, can help us stop feeling hopeless. We get gaslit a lot that we're not real Christians because we don't buy into some of these motivated reasonings. And I think the more Christians who can stand up and say, that's not true, here's why that's not true, here's what's happening to you, this is why this is wrong, it can help us get our bearings, and we can actually get on with living a life following Jesus in the kingdom of God. So thank you so much for this book and for being with us today, Scott. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your interest in the project, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's been delightful.